Hello, hello, hello. Okay, so this is Reading the Times for Thursday, October 28th, 2021. Reading the Times for Thursday, October 28th, 2021. We're going to do Thursday, and then we're going to do Friday, and uh, and then today is Wednesday. So we'll do Thursday, Friday today, and then tomorrow we'll try to catch up Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, maybe Thursday. Yeah, maybe we'll do 2 in the morning, 2 in the evening tomorrow. And then and then Friday will be to our regularly scheduled um, program. I'll wake up early because it takes about 3 to 4 hours to summarize this news into an hour format. So this is about 4 to 6 hours worth of work every day, which will be practice for me, just processing information. I've done this early 2000, well, actually January 1st, 2020. I started this technique, did it for a couple months, and then what do you know? We got hit with a pandemic. So it's very interesting that I started reading the New York Times every day to summarize information right when we got hit with a pandemic. So I saw it all unfold from the news January 1st onwards, 2020. And even myself, reading the New York Times every day didn't quite get the magnitude of what was going on until my birthday around March 15th. So I have firsthand account of how long it takes people to get the gravity of a situation. Um, I've tracked who got it early, who got it midstream. I think I was like midstream, and who got it late. A lot of our political leaders, including Gavin Newsom here in California, got it late. One of the reasons for the recall. They claim it's a Republican recall, President Trump, but no, we expect our political leaders to catch trends early in order to protect us. That's one of the ways they're failing us. A bunch of other ways. Um, Narratives. They're not describing our reality in stories best suited to capture these trends, but also leadership. They're not leading from the front. Literally, using the pandemic as an example. I can show you how these tools, this is a tool I'm creating, Reading the Times, a summary of information so you can get the New York Times within an hour instead of having to spend the 3 to 4 hours to read the whole paper yourself. And you can get it auditorially, me reading it to you. This is a tool for processing information faster. I have other tools in development. This is one. If you support and fund this project, I can hire it out to other people and move on to developing other tools. But using these types of tools, we can manage ourself better than our political leaders. And I can use a pandemic as an example. Using this very crude tool, I was able to get a handle of the situation faster, and I've documented people who were ahead of the curve. Our political leaders, it's a, what do you call it? Fugazi. They're not political leaders. They're leeches, and they're draining from us energy, time, resources, but they don't provide what they claim to provide. They are not, and so just the simplest of tools I've developed are already better than what our politicians are offering us. And I could use a pandemic as an example. Yeah, okay. So my name is Shaz. Shaz, running for California's 20th congressional district. Ways you can help. Spread the word. Talk to someone about me. If anyone's watching this, they aren't. But this weekend, after I do this for a week, I'm going to try to spread the word out myself. And we'll see if other people can too. That's free. It's free to talk to people about what crazy Shaz is up to. Give me $1. That's not free, but it's $1. You find that in your couch cushion. Send it to my Venmo. Help me help you. The sooner I can hire this out to someone else to do it and turn it into a job, the sooner I create an actual social media news company. So that way we can institutionalize this, turn it into something that is ongoing with a real budget. Seek advertisers, seek a way to fund it, maybe subscription through the Substack, these other subscription services, Patreon, whatnot. But first, we need startup money. We're bootstrapping. We need your help. And if you send me $1, maybe I send you a sticker. You send me $5, I'm definitely sending you a sticker. What else? Reserve my books if you really want to help me, help my publishing company get off the ground, help my writing. This is one project, just a news project, but in general, the best vehicle for ideas is still the written word. Online, we're reading more than ever before. Reserve my books, they're about $20 a piece, $15 plus $5 shipping and handling. Right now, we're selling Zen Buddhism, Tao Te Shaz, and Good Barracks, DATAOTESHAZZ.com and GOODBARICS.com. We're dealing with a lot of information, a lot of emotions. When we have information outside of narratives, usually it's emotional and releasing because it's more dense, but releasing emotional information can be traumatic. It can be triggering. I've noticed myself when I get too emotional, I'm like, whoa, Shaz. Listen. Someone reminded me, I say a lot of stuff that I don't remember. So someone reminded me recently, they're like, Shaz, you said something I saved. You said emotions are instructive, but they're not emotion or they're not instructions. So I'll repeat my own quote given back to me. Emotions are instructive, but they're not instructions. So listen to your emotions, sit with them, but you don't, very rarely in times of danger, in times of love, there's sometimes you have to speak your truth directly as soon as it comes. Hey, get away. Hey, I need to use this anger to defend myself. Hey, I need to use this love to speak my truth to make sure you don't leave that door because I need you in my life. Sometimes our emotions have to go from feeling to action immediately, but usually you want to, if it's not existential, if it's not life threatening, if you're not going to lose the opportunity, you want to sit with them and let them process. Takes a week or two. I just had a death in the family and it's going to take a lifetime, right? It's a lot of emotions. You breathe into them. You pray, you meditate, whatever your practice is to dilute them. And so that's why we're beginning with some wisdom traditions of diluting, transmuting emotions. I believe that is the beneficial aspect of religion. The negative aspects, of course, are dogma, control, emotional manipulation. But the positive aspects are emotional growth, which I believe is a very good shorthand for character. Character is the ability you've displayed over your life for emotional growth, right? I mean, the names for the other aspects to attributes we find good in a human are what knowledge, hard work, honesty, integrity. But character is what you are when the stress is on you. When someone told me that in real estate, I lashed out at him because I felt he lost us a deal. And he said, Shaz, your character is revealed during the hard times, not the good times. And that shut me the hell up. I was like, this man's got a point. And I knew that man was a man of character because he himself was in real estate because he got blacklisted from Wall Street because he was a whistleblower. He told regulators about what his company was doing wrong, and they cracked down on that company, but then no one else would hire him. And I respected that. He told me a story when we first met, so I knew he was a man of character. When he checked me, I was like, so your track record speaks for itself. Your character is revealed when the chips are down, but we work on ourselves. We go to the gym, to be stronger. So when my buddy says, I need to move my apartment in New York, I'm like, I got you, man. Me, you, and maybe one other friend, we got this in 2 hours because I know I'm a strong dude and I can lift heavy shit. The same thing, you work on yourself, your character. So when you have that death in the family, you have that heartbreak, which this last year I've gone through. You hear those emotions come out, dissolving a relationship, or at least de-escalating it to a friendship. That's when your self-work comes out. And those practices we have, sometimes they're physical. Yoga is a practice that I find helps me with my breathing and helps me with my emotions. So that's Tao Te Shaz, Good Barracks. I believe those are building blocks for my own path of developing my character. I've written others since then, but we're going to start with those. Okay, enough with this 10 minutes of Shaz. Now time to do this. I should blow my nose before I start, so that way we're not snotting all over this thing. That's enough. We cleared it out enough. All right. Let's knock this out within an hour, Shaz. Shaz speaking speed has sped up a little bit. This is Shaz at 1.25 speed. Hunting for money, Democrats rush to rewrite tax code. frantic attempt to overhaul the complex U.S. tax code remained in a state of flux on Wednesday, with Senator Joe Manchin III and some House Democrats expressing reservations about a tax on billionaires that was proposed earlier in the day by Senator Ron Wyden of Oregon. Senator Mark Warner, a Virginia Democrat, acknowledged on Wednesday that the rapid pace of the legislation processed posed a risk and said it would be preferable to allow some of this very, very complicated tax policy to get an appropriate airing back and forth. The need to roll out new tax proposals stems largely from the concerns of business groups and moderate Democrats who effectively killed Mr. Biden's initial plan to raise the corporate tax rate to 28% from 21% to pay for its clean energy and social policy initiatives. A second proposal, which Mr. Biden has supported in the past, would impose a 15% tax on companies that report at least $1 billion in profits to shareholders, but have little to no federal tax liability as a result of tax deductions and other loopholes. At the time, Democrats such as Mr. Wyden, who is now the chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, assailed Republicans for rushing ahead to pass this bill without knowing its full cost. It's really striking to me that the same Democrats who derided Republicans for supposedly rushing a partisan tax cut in 2017 are now teeing up massive tax hikes on a party line vote, including an unvetted and likely unconstitutional wealth tax, on the sole argument that failure is not an option, said Brian McGuire, the former chief of staff for Senator Mitch McConnell, the Republican leader. The spine of the tax code went largely unchanged for 3 decades after President Ronald Reagan signed a bipartisan bill in 1986 that reduced many tax rates, but also closed off several avenues that people and corporations had for reducing their tax bill. Daniel Hamel, a left leaning tax law professor at the University of Chicago, mused on Twitter that Democrats would be better off simply raising tax rates and closing the state loopholes. China's weapons test close to a Sputnik moment, U.S. general says. China's testing of a hypersonic missile designed to evade American nuclear defenses was very close to a Sputnik moment for the United States. General Mark A. Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, said on Wednesday in the first official confirmation of how Beijing's demonstration of its weapon capabilities had taken American officials by surprise. United States officials remained mostly silent until General Milley spoke on Wednesday, talking about the test on a Bloomberg television interview show hosted by David Rubenstein, the billionaire investor and philanthropist. Mr. Wood, a longtime American diplomat, spoke before General Milley's characterization of the test, but noted that hypersonic technology was something that we have been concerned about for a long time. Starting in 2014, Beijing conducted a series of hypersonic flight tests, and it has since deployed with its armed forces a medium range missile known as the DF 17. For its part, China said the flight test this summer, it has acknowledged only one, though U.S. officials said there were two, was of a reusable space vehicle, not a nuclear capable hypersonic missile. Mr. Kirby made clear that the United States was competing in the same arena as China, saying, our own pursuit of hypersonic capabilities is real, it's tangible, and we are absolutely working towards being able to develop that capability. But I won't get into the specifics of testing and where we are going. Then, just hours after General Milley had compared the test to one of the defining moments in the Cold War with Russia, Mr. Kirby seemed to warn against using the same terminology in the case against China. He unleashed a California massacre. Should the school be named after him? For the past 4 years, the University of California Hastings College of Law has been investigating the role of its founder, Serranus Hastings, in one of the darkest yet least discussed chapters of the state's history. Mr. Hastings, one of the wealthiest men in California in that era and the state's first Chief Justice, masterminded one set of massacres across Northern California, north of Napa's vineyards, along the banks of the Russian River, and in numerous other places from the deserts to redwood groves. As many as 5,617 native people, and perhaps more whose deaths were not recorded, were massacred by officially sanctioned military and U.S. troops from the 1840s to the 1870s. Campaigns often initiated by white settlers like Mr. Hastings, who wanted to use the land for their own purposes. In 1878, Mr. Hastings donated $100,000 in gold coin to found the school that carries his name, California's first law school. The debate over what to do at Hastings comes during renewed attention to the period of Spanish missions, when tens of thousands of Indians were forced to give up local customs and died of disease. And the legacy of native enslavement, historians estimate that 20,000 Native Americans were enslaved in the first decades after California became a state in 1850, even though it officially barred slavery. What would remove what would removing the Hastings name accomplish? Mr. Fagman wrote when the results of the school's investigation into Hastings' legacy were made public in September of last year. Gangs rule much of Haiti. For many, it means no fuel, no power, no food. Gangs blocking Haiti's ports, choking off fuel shipments. After a presidential assassination, an earthquake, and a tropical storm, a new crisis is gripping Haiti. A severe fuel shortage is pushing the nation to the brink of collapse because gangs, not the government, rule about half of the nation's capital. Haiti only goes backward. The only gear we have is reverse. In a news conference on Tuesday, Jimmy Cherizier, one of the country's most feared gang leaders, acknowledged that his criminal network was blocking the delivery of fuel. We are looking to see how we can open a path so that the fuel could be delivered to hospitals. Stoking class tensions, Mr. Cherizier called on Haitians to turn on the business and political elite, calling them hoodlums. In many countries, a fuel shortage would mean transportation is disrupted. Without fuel, everything just shuts down. Mr. Bout said, adding that 1 in 4 digital cellular towers are out without fuel to operate. There's no authorities in those areas. The fuel crisis is playing out across Haiti with residents of far flung towns surrounding vehicles as they drive through and insisting on siphoning off fuel from their tanks before letting them continue. Michelle Wu makes her play for power in Boston. On November 2nd, when Miss Wu, 36, faces off against another city counselor Anissa Essivi George in Boston's mayoral election, she could break a barrier nationally. Of the country's 100 largest cities, 6 have Asian American mayors, all in California or Texas, according to the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies. During a legal fellowship in Boston City Hall, she designed a streamlined licensing process for restaurants and started a food truck program, attracting the interest of Thomas M. Menino, the mayor at the time. John Connolly, a former city councilor who ran against Mr. Walsh in 2013, credits her with a phenomenal, genius level understanding of field politics, similar to Mr. Menino in her photographic memory of nooks and crannies of Boston. She can tell you all the 6 places Albanians socialize in Roselandale, he said. The vote cast a shadow over her victory. Many progressives saw her choice as an act of political self interest, and conservatives, who were paid the favor by backing her for city council president in 2015, were disappointed when she resumed voting with progressives, Mr. Linehan said in an interview. In 2020, after she criticized a city coronavirus fund, he remarked that it would be better if the city councilor just took time out of her schedule just to give me a call and maybe go on a call to talk to us. In September 2020, she was the first candidate to declare a run against Mr. Walsh at a moment when polls showed he was heavily favored to win. Old power gear is slowing use of clean energy and electric cars. It's no small problem. Electric grids are also under strain from climate change itself. The Garcias were surprised when their utility, Pacific Gas and Electric, would not allow them to fully use the panels. We're very ambitious. The question is whether there will be a grid ready when we get there. Mark Esguerra, Senior Director of Electric Asset Strategy at PG&E, said the company planned to upgrade a lot more of its equipment. Consider the following example. If all 330,000 households in San Jose gave up using gasoline and natural gas and switched to electric cars, heat pumps, and electric water heaters and stoves, the city would use 3 times as much electricity as it does now, according to Rewiring America, a nonprofit group that advocates grid upgrades and policies to fight climate change. Emily Fisher, Senior Vice President for Clean Energy at the Edison Electric Institute, a utility industry trade group, Gave another example. Electrify America, a subsidy of Volkswagen that operates an electric vehicle charging network, has installed large batteries at some charging stations to avoid paying fees that utilities impose on businesses that draw too much power. Taliban allows girls to return to some high schools, but with big caveats. International human rights groups have admonished the new government for not yet reopening all schools to girls, even as their male classmates returned last month, and accused the Taliban of using threats and intimidation to keep attendance rates for all girls low for all girl for all girls schools low. The policies currently pursued by the Taliban are discriminatory, unjust, and violate international law. Sitting in his office in downtown Mazar-i-Sharif one recent afternoon, the Taliban's director of education for Balkh province, Abdul Jalil Shahid Khel, insisted that the new government planned to reopen girls' middle and high schools in other provinces soon. Understand the Taliban in Afghanistan. I don't proofread this, so we'll skip that sentence. The Taliban arose in 1994 amid the turmoil that came after the withdrawal of Soviet forces from Afghanistan in 1898 or 1989. Who are the Taliban leaders? They are the top leaders of the Taliban, men who have spent years on the run, in hiding in jail and dodging American drones. How did the Taliban gain control? See how the Taliban retook power in Afghanistan in a few months and read about how their strategy enabled them to do so. What happens to the women in Afghanistan? The last time the Taliban were in power, they barred women and girls from taking most jobs or going to school. Pope expresses willingness to visit Canada for Indigenous reconciliation. The Vatican announced Wednesday that Pope Francis had indicated his willingness to visit Canada after Indigenous leaders in the country had repeatedly demanded he apologize for the church's role in residential schools found to be responsible for widespread abuse. A National Truth and Reconciliation Commission determined in 2015 that residential schools, a system of mandatory boarding schools for Indigenous children that were mostly operated by Catholic organizations, were a form of cultural genocide. Physical and sexual abuse was widespread at schools, the commission found, and it called on the Pope to apologize. Mr. Obed said that he and other Indigenous leaders also want the Pope to ensure that the Catholic Church in Canada finally fulfills its obligation under a settlement reached in 2006 in a class action lawsuit filed by former residential school students. The remains of what are presumed to be Indigenous children have been discovered at the sites of defunct boarding schools in Canada. Here's what you should know. Background. About 1883, Indigenous children in many parts of Canada were forced to attend residential schools in a forced assimilation program. Most of these schools were operated by churches, and all of them banned the use of Indigenous languages and Indigenous cultural practices, often through violence. At McKinsey, widespread fur over work with planet's biggest polluters. Documents reviewed by the New York Times, interviews with four former McKinsey employees, and publicly available records, such as the lawsuit, shed new light on the extraordinary scope of that work. DJ Corella, a spokesman for McKinsey, said in a statement that reducing emissions worldwide requires engaging with high emitting sectors to help them transition. Walking away from these sectors might appease absolutist critics, he said, but it would do nothing to solve the climate challenge. McKinsey isn't alone among consulting firms in working with major polluters. In its annual report for 2019, Donald R. Lindsay, Tech's chief executive, it said that a project that McKinsey consulted on helped to improve productivity and lower cost. In Asia, McKinsey distributed a video boasting that it had helped increase production at a coal company by 26%, according to a memo written in 2019 by Eric Edstrom, a departing McKinsey consultant who was concerned about the firm's environmental impact. A spokesman for Tech, Chris Stanell, said in a statement that the company is committed to supporting global action on climate change, and we are taking action to reduce our GHG emissions, including setting goal of being carbon neutral across our operations by 2050. Mr. Corella said it was deeply misleading to focus on one company, Tech, as evidence that McKinsey's work exacerbates climate change. So the Times provided the consulting firm with a list of 43 major carbon polluters that recently been clients. The author said that McKinsey's failure to address its clients' emissions poses serious risk to our reputation, our client's reputation, and our ability to build a great firm that attracts, develops, excites, and retains exceptional people. But the moment also presented McKinsey with a significant opportunity, they wrote. The McKinsey spokesman said the firm has already addressed the issues the letter raised when it was sent and had created a new platform to help clients cut their emissions. What happened when a hellishly hot tiny town offered free land? From the air, a tiny outback town of Quilpie, Queensland, appears to be in the middle of nowhere. Quilpie suddenly found itself the object of global desire recently when it unveiled a plan to combat a housing shortage and lure new residents by offering free plots of land. In the 2 weeks since the word went out on October 11th via local news media, Quilpie has received more than 300 inquiries, officials said, including from as far away as Hong Kong and Europe. Mr. Hancock's idea is a merger of two forces seen the world over: the need to find cheap housing and the push by small or waning towns to expand or inject new life into their communities. Rabina Meehan, 41, put in an offer on one of the plots even before she knew about the fund because she said even 12,500 seemed too good to not take up. There's a freedom and self-sufficiency in living in rural towns that you can't find in the city, Miss Meehan said. Whereas in the city, you can't do any of that. You can just plant a little garden full of lettuce. Miss Meehan moved to Quilpie with her husband and two children 18 months ago from their farm in New South Wales. Iran will rejoin nuclear talks, top negotiator said. Iran will rejoin international talks on limiting its nuclear program before the end of November, its deputy foreign minister and chief negotiator said Wednesday, raising hopes that negotiations stalled since June by the election of a hardline Iranian president can be revived. The official Ali Bagheri Khani said on Twitter that Iran had agreed to restart talks on reviving the 2015 nuclear deal after very serious and constructive dialogue with Enrique Mora, a European Union negotiator. President Donald J. Trump reimposed sanctions in 2018 in hopes that choking Iran's economy again would force it to negotiate more restrictive terms. Iran's previous president, Hassan Rouhani, had been elected amid hopes that a deal could open up Iran's economy, offering new opportunities and better lives for a population that has lived under some form of Western sanctions for decades. Iran has already enriched uranium far beyond its limits set in 2015, and experts said it had made irreversible advances in nuclear technology. In a previous Twitter post, Mr. Bagheri Khani said Iran is determined to engage in negotiations that would remove unlawful and cruel sanctions in full and effective manner, secure normalization of trades and economic relations with Iran, and provide credible guarantee for no further reneging. Japan's communists are hardly radical, but make it handy election target. The Japan Communist Party is the oldest political party in the country. Though clocking in at only 3% of support in the polls, the communists have been a handy boogeyman after teaming up with Japan's leading opposition parties for the first time in an effort to dethrone the LDP. The communists agreed to withdraw their candidates from several districts to avoid splitting the liberal vote. The Japanese Communist Party, founded in 1922, has long provoked government animosity. And focusing attention on the Japan Communists, the LDP and its governing party, Komeito, are betting that voters' distaste for big C communism and fear of a rising China will drive them away from opposition coalition, said Taku Sugawara, an independent political scientist. The Japan communists prefer a diplomatic approach and are strongly opposed to the substantial American military presence in Japan, a position that makes it an outlier among Japanese political parties. The Japan communists have said that their differences with other opposition parties would have no bearing on a new government. Israel advances plan for new settlement homes, first in Bennett era. A Defense Ministry Planning Committee approved the construction of 3,130 new homes that would spread across 25 existing settlements, most of them deep inside the West Bank, the territory that Palestinians hope will form a part of a future Palestinian state. The coalition is an unwieldy alliance of left-wingers, centrist, and Arab Islamists who support the two-state solution. Right-wingers like Mr. Bennett, a former settler leader who opposes Palestinian sovereignty, and center-right politicians like Benny Gantz, who has previously expressed qualified support for a truncated Palestinian state, but who, as defense minister, oversaw Wednesday's decision to expand settlements. Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority, criticized the announcement on Wednesday, calling on international leaders in a statement to confront these Israeli decisions and practices that seek to steal Palestinian land and push matters toward a state of instability and tension, which will negatively affect everyone. A State Department spokesman, Ned Price, criticized the Israeli government's plan to build more than 3,000 new settlement units in the occupied West Bank, saying the move damages the prospects for a two-state solution. We strongly oppose the expansion of settlements, which is completely inconsistent with efforts to lower tensions and to ensure calm, and it damages the prospects for a two-state solution. The Bennett government has attempted to placate Palestinians, the U.S. government, and leftist members of its own coalition by making modest gestures to the Palestinians, including an increase in the number of Israeli work permits granted to Palestinians, the provision of identity papers to several thousand undocumented Palestinians in the West Bank, a 156 million loan to the Palestinian Authority, which manages part of the West Bank, and several high-level conversations between Palestinian and Israeli officials, including Mr. Gantz. To the government's critics, it has undermined these gestures by doing little to curb a sharp rise in settler violence against Palestinians, allowing Jewish prayer to continue at the Aqsa Mosque compound in Jerusalem, and expanding the settlement and outlying the rights groups. Mossi Raz, a lawmaker for Maritz, a left-wing party of the coalition, said in a radio interview on Wednesday evening that settlement expansion was a slap in the faces of hundreds of thousands of wonderful people who protested every week to bring down Netanyahu's government and bring about a change. In response, Mr. Elkin told broadcasters, I am not deciding whether or not they meet with Abu Mazen, a nickname for Mr. Abbas, the head of the Palestinian Authority. So they shouldn't decide for me whether there is a settlement freeze. Yosemite Falls surges after West Coast storms bring needed rainfall. The remnants of two storm systems that converged in drought stricken California this week helped pump new life into one of Yosemite Park's most popular attractions, Yosemite Falls. We had quite a storm, the park said in an Instagram post on Tuesday, after more than 6 inches of rain fell over a 36-hour period. Although the park said it did not have direct measurements, it said that sensors suggest a few feet of snow fell at the higher elevations, and that the snow level for much of the storm was high, which caused rivers and creeks to rise substantially. The Merced River at the Pohono Bridge rose 8.5 feet, the park said, noting it was 1.5 feet below flood stage. At 2,425 feet, Yosemite Falls is the tallest waterfall in North America. San Francisco saw at least 4 inches of rain in a 24-hour period, the city's fourth wettest day ever, the Weather Service said on Monday. Forecasters paid tribute with a haiku. We did ask for rain. We begged and pleaded for it. And boy, did it come. But the rain records will not end California's ongoing drought. Nor'easter brings hurricane force winds to Massachusetts. Hurricane force winds from an early season nor'easter swept through coastal New England on Wednesday, a day after battering the New York City area, sending trees crashing into power lines and cutting electricity to hundreds of thousands of households. The same storm struck the New York City area on Tuesday with heavy rain, strong winds, and the threat of flash floods, although the region was largely spared the type of deadly weather brought by the remnants of Hurricane Ida last month. Roads flooded across the region, with flood warnings in effect through Wednesday for the Saddle River in Lodi, New Jersey, and for the Ramapo River in northern New Jersey and Orange and Rockland counties in New York. New Yorkers woke up on Wednesday to dry skies but gusty winds. At least 43 people died across New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut amid the hurricane's watery remnants. Someday, maybe we'll just have a regular rainstorm. We don't seem to get those much anymore. Joseph Fiordaliso, who leads New Jersey's utility board, said at a news conference on Tuesday, adding, climate change is real and we have to work to mitigate it as much as we possibly can. Another storm was set to bring heavy rain to the Northeast early in the weekend, after sweeping across the county's midsection the country's midsection with gusty winds and thunderstorms on Thursday and Friday. FEMA says it's still working to fix racial disparities in disaster aid. Seems to be a lot of hemming and hawing. A growing body of research shows that FEMA, the government agency responsible for helping Americans recover from disasters, often helps white disaster victims more than people of color, even when the amount of damage is the same. Based on FEMA's response to its advisory panel, she added, "It really just sounds to me like they're still working on it." Citing data on racial disparities, FEMA's National Advisory Council, a group of emergency management experts appointed by the agency, concluded in November that FEMA was failing to meet its legal obligation to help disaster victims without discriminating on racial or other grounds. Many FEMA programs do not consider the principle of equity, the report read. The council made four specific recommendations to the agency to address racial disparities more effectively. Third, the council called on FEMA to create a training program for its workers to make them more sensitive to racial diversity, equity, and inclusion. Finally, the council told FEMA to establish clear directives and policies for hiring a workforce that reflects the population it serves. The council asked the agency to establish those training and hiring practices by the middle of 2021. Academics who study racial disparities in FEMA's programs say the response showed an agency still trying to figure out how to respond to growing criticism. Racing the clock. The Democrats grasp for a deal on Biden's agenda. Democrats struggled on Wednesday to cobble together an expansive social policy, climate change, and tax increase plan, reaching for an elusive compromise on President Biden's agenda, even as centrist holdouts in the Senate refused to embrace key components. House Democrats held out hope of a breakthrough on the domestic policy measure that could also put $1 trillion bipartisan infrastructure bill on track for a vote as soon as Thursday. Leading progressives demanded to see the legislative text of the bill before they would support a vote on the infrastructure measure, which has stalled for months as Democrats have searched, so far in vain, for a compromise on their broader social policy plan. Mr. Biden planned to delay a Thursday morning departure for a trip to Europe by a few hours so he can meet with House Democrats, according to two people familiar with the situation. Because of united Republican opposition, Democrats are pushing the social policy plan through Congress using a special budget process known as reconciliation, which shields tax and spending legislation from a filibuster. Mr. Manchin's objections to the leave program could be a final blow to the plan, which has already been whittled down to 4 weeks from a dozen as Democrats trimmed the package. Before Kyle Rittenhouse's murder trial, a debate over terms like victim. Legal experts state that determining who should be considered a victim in a case that hinges on Mr. Rittenhouse's assertion of self defense is at the center of what jurors must decide in his trial, expected to begin next week. State law in Wisconsin allows a person to fire in self defense if the shooter reasonably believes that such force is necessary to prevent imminent death or great bodily harm to himself or herself. A lawyer for Mr. Rittenhouse, who has said he traveled to Kenosha to protect businesses and help people injured during the protest, has said that Mr. Rittenhouse was being pursued and feared for his life in the chaotic aftermath of a third night of protest. The jury has to assess whether they were posing a threat of death or bodily harm or great bodily harm to Rittenhouse. To assess that, you have to look at their behavior and you have to look at what Rittenhouse was aware of. Judge Schroeder, who has been on the bench in Wisconsin for several decades, has spent many pretrial hearings in the Rittenhouse case this year, parsing language, terminology, past behavior of the men who were shot, and the actions of Mr. Rittenhouse in the months leading up to the shootings. Prosecutors have repeatedly tried to introduce evidence of Mr. Rittenhouse's associations with the far-right Proud Boys, as well as a cell phone video taken weeks before the shooting in September. In Kenosha, in which Mr. Rittenhouse suggested that he wished he had his rifle so he could shoot men leaving a pharmacy. In September, the judge denied a request from prosecutors to admit a video taken several months before the shooting that showed Mr. Rittenhouse hiring a teenager in the midst of a fight that involved hitting a teenager. That showed Mr. Rittenhouse hitting a teenager in the midst of a fight that involved his sister. During Monday's hearing, Corey Cherafisi, a lawyer for Mr. Rittenhouse, argued that the jury should hear more about the totality of the circumstances, expanding on a defense motion, arguing that Mr. Rosenbaum threatened people and was throwing homemade gas bombs on the night Mr. Rittenhouse shot him. Shutout on budget bill. Republicans take shots from the sidelines. Top Republican lawmakers, who are usually mobbed by reporters, walked unimpeded through the Capitol corridors while Democrats are chased down for any snippet of the current state of play. As recently as 2017, Republicans went it alone on their Trump era tax cuts, using the budget reconciliation process, which shields legislation from a filibuster known as knowing that Democrats would not support the corporate tax break the GOP was eagerly handing out. As someone who is openly as somebody who is open to ideas from both sides and works on a lot of different initiatives with Democrats, to really not be involved or engaged in any aspect of it is really odd. But there seems to be no fear of missing out among Republicans, given their hostility to emerging domestic policy package, which, even in its scaled back form, as Democrats whittle it down to appease crucial centrists, would lead to a level of social spending that is anathema to GOP lawmakers. Obviously, we don't like being shut out of policymaking, but that is the choice they make. In the meantime, Mr. Cornyn, like many of his Republican colleagues, has been captivated by the political and policy intrigue and numerous twists and turns as congressional Democrats and President Biden struggle to reach a deal. Their non participation has freed up Republicans to unleash a political barrage against the Democratic legislation as various ideas rise and fall, providing multiple targets for the GOP. Now, with Democrats promising an agreement is within reach, Republicans are increasingly taking to the floor and other avenues available to them to assail the emerging plan. In the Senate, Republicans active on energy and environmental issues blocked off a chunk of floor time on Wednesday to rip what they call the reckless tax and spending spree being pursued by Democrats. No one holds these guys to the historic record. It's like, what did you guys do under Trump? But, I mean, that's what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is create objective reality. It's going to take a minute. Give me a couple weeks. We'll get there. New guidance bars immigration enforcement in protected areas. The Biden administration on Wednesday designated the nation's schools and hospitals, as well as a wide array of other locations, off limits to immigration enforcement, the latest sign that is committed to protecting millions of undocumented residents from deportation, while efforts to offer them a path to legalization remain stalled in Congress. The new guidelines, effective immediately, list protected areas where immigration agents are to refrain from making arrests, conducting searches, serving subpoenas, or carrying out other enforcement acts. The guidelines represent the third policy issued by the Biden administration in recent weeks with the goal of bringing greater humanity to immigration enforcement, Mr. Mayorkas said. A memo detailing the policy, which applies to field agents for immigration and customs enforcement and customs and border protection, said that agents must, to the fullest extent possible, refrain from enforcement action in the type of locations on the list at all times. An exception Any exceptions must be approved by agency headquarters, the memo said. Mr. Mayorkas, who has presided over the new enforcement strategy, issued the first set of new interior priorities last month, directing agents at Immigration and Customs Enforcement to target for removal from the country only migrants who had recently crossed the border or people who posed a threat to public safety. The mass roundups, often at food processing plants, were a staple of immigration enforcement during the Trump administration. Republicans assail Garland over Justice Department schools memo. Republicans berated Attorney General Merrick B. Garland on Wednesday over the Justice Department's initiative to address threats of violence and harassment directed at school administrators, teachers, and school board members, incidents that have increased as education has become a cultural war battleground. The barrage of criticism from Republicans on Senate Judiciary Committee came 1 week after Mr. Garland faced similar sharp questions from Republicans on the House Judiciary Committee. While spirited debate about policy matters is protected under our Constitution, that protection does not extend to threats of violence or efforts to intimidate individuals based on their views, Mr. Garland wrote. Mr. Garland has also issued memos announcing initiatives to address harassment of election workers, as well as rise in hate crimes against Asian people. In the memo, Mr. Garland did not detail any specific threats of violence or offer reasons for the increase in harassment and threats. Senator Tom Cotton, Republican of Arkansas, said that Mr. Garland's memo came just days after the head of the National School Board Association wrote a letter to Mr. Biden that detailed instances of disruptions and threats at school board meetings. In Virginia, early voting has an impact and a long run. The coronavirus pandemic has helped convert more and more voters into early voters. In 2020 presidential election, in the 2020 presidential election, the early vote made up 63% of the electorate, up from 36% in 2016. Even as conservatives have attacked the legitimacy of voting by mail with false claims of widespread fraud, the popularity of early voting in Virginia by both Democrats and Republicans has been shaping the dynamics of the race and may play a role in delaying the final results if the election is extraordinarily close. Early vote totals in Virginia reflect more a shift in behavior than a rising turnout, as 90% of early voters in Virginia this year also voted early in the 2020 election, according to TargetSmart, a Democratic political data firm. We have seen a meaningful jump in the daily early vote totals from the past week, with over 250,000 ballots cast since last Monday, concentrated in high density Democratic areas in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. The new laws that opened access to early voting, approved by a Democratic controlled state legislator and a Democratic governor in both 2020 and 2021, were criticized by some Republicans as attempting to write partisan advantage into the election code. Mr. Youngkin has aggressively embraced early voting and vote by mail, often holding rallies near early voting sites, encouraging attendees to vote afterward. His campaign runs text message programs geared towards early voting, and door to door knockers help chase down mail ballots. GOP attack involving Toni Morrison novel inflames Virginia contest. Democrats, the Youngkin ad was both a throwback to the days of book banning and a coded. Ooh, let me. That's good. That's good. To Democrats, the Youngkin ad was both a throwback to the days of book banning and a coded insult to one of America's most celebrated Black authors. After months of frantic Republican alarms in Virginia and nationwide about how school children are being educated about racism, their McAuliffe staff members handed out copies of Beloved and other books by Miss Morrison, along with bookmarks proclaiming that Mr. Youngkin would ban books in Virginia schools. Liberal television hosts quickly scheduled interviews with scholars who extolled the importance of her work. It's a reminder to Virginia voters how extreme Glenn Youngkin is, despite going to great lengths to look like a harmless suburban dad, said Josh Schwerin, a strategist who worked on Mr. McAuliffe's 2013 campaign. I don't think parents have any idea the race of whoever wrote any book. They think the descriptions are things parents should know about. Former Governor Bob McDonnell, the Republican who in 2013 signed a law declaring Virginia parents have a fundamental right to direct the upbringing, education, and care of their children, said Mr. Youngkin had tapped into a rich vein of voter discontent. In 2013, Miss Murphy, who said her son blank told her that the novel gave him nightmares, began lobbying for policies giving parents more control over what their children read in class. After several years of lobbying by Miss Murphy and others, the Republican led General Assembly passed a bill with bipartisan support, giving parents the right to review and opt their children out of instructional material that includes sexually explicit content. The legislation would have made Virginia the only state to give parents that power. Briefs draw battle lines as Texas abortion law nears Supreme Court. Days after the Supreme Court agreed to fast track challenges to a Texas abortion law, setting an exceptionally abbreviated schedule, the parties filed a flurry of briefs on Wednesday attacking and defending the law. The right way to challenge the law, Mr. Paxton said, was for abortion providers to violate it, to be sued in state court, and present constitutional or other arguments as defense. The Constitution does not guarantee pre enforcement review of state laws in federal court, Mr. Paxton wrote. The cases Whole Woman's Health versus Jackson, number 21463, and United States versus Texas, number 21588, are focused on the novel structure of the Texas law, which was devised to avoid federal review in federal court. The law effectively deputizes ordinary citizens, including those from outside Texas, to allow them to sue clinics and others who violate the law. Jonathan F. Mitchell, a lawyer who helped draft the law and who represents individuals who said they want to preserve the right to sue under it, also filed a brief, writing that the federal government was not entitled to challenge the law. There are risk security constraints put zero risk security constraints put U.S. diplomats at a disadvantage, Blinken says. Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China met with senior Taliban officials on Wednesday and urged the United States to step up its diplomacy to avoid a humanitarian disaster in Afghanistan. Under the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan, huh, you know what? I already read this. So the only new sentence out of this is Foreign Minister Wang Yi of China met with senior Taliban officials on Wednesday, urging the United States to step up its diplomacy to avoid a humanitarian disaster. That's what we're going to take from this. And then in the future, I'm going to stop copying. I copy and paste information and then I summarize it. So it's like sometimes the New York Times has taglines it includes in every article about a subject. So once I copy and paste that tag, that certain block, I have to avoid it in the future. I didn't avoid it in that last one. Technical difficulties. Yeah, you are. Start to lose your voice after a little bit, but this is good. That's why we do this also to practice public speaking and speaking for a long period of time. Who knows if I'm elected to Congress, I might need some filibuster muscles. We're working on our filibuster muscles. Shaz does everything for a reason. Gun handed to Alec Baldwin was not thoroughly checked, affidavit said. Yeah, let's talk about Alec Baldwin some more, right? Sheriff Mendoza said that the investigators believe they recovered more live rounds on the film set at Bonanza Creek Ranch and that they would be sending some of the ammunition they seized to the FBI crime lab for analysis. We have recovered what we believe to be possible additional live rounds on set. The film's armorer, Hannah Gutierrez Reed, told the detective that no live ammo is ever kept on set. According to the affidavit, describing the safety protocols on set, Mr. Hallis said that Miss Gutierrez Reed typically opened guns for him to inspect. Sheriff Mendoza said about 500 rounds of ammunition had been recovered from the set, including a mixture of blanks, dummy rounds, and what the sheriff department believed to be live ammunition. There were at least 2 accidental gun discharges on the set of Rust before the fatal shooting, according to 3 former members of the film's crew. It is getting spicy, though. An Oath Keeper was at the Capitol riots on Tuesday. He's on the ballot. The country's Republican chairman, Jack Ziza, defended Mr. Durfee as a mild-mannered conservative, but said that his main attribute was far more transactional. He was the only person willing to run. It's a very tough district for Republicans, and Mr. Durfee was, frankly, one of only a couple people who put his name in, Mr. Ziza said. Mr. Durfee is one of dozens of Oath Keepers across country who are already in office or running for election, nearly all of them Republican, according to a ProPublica analysis of the hacked database. If the Republican Party can only find people like that, he said, what does it say about the party? Mr. Durfee said he drove from New Jersey on January 6th to help with an Oath Keeper security detail. Mr. Durfee runs the Oath Keepers Northern New Jersey operation and said he was responsible for maintaining the national group's email and membership lists, which were included in the documents that were hacked. Assemblywoman Valerie Vanieri Huddle, a Democrat who represents Mr. Durfee's district, said she saw his candidacy mainly as an indicator of Mr. Trump's grip on the Republican Party, even in liberal bastions like Bergen County. How New York just took a big step away from fossil fuels. In a major win for climate advocates and supporters of wind solar energy, New York State environmental regulators refused on Wednesday to allow 2 companies to upgrade their gas-fueled power plants, signaling a new aggressive approach to ending fossil fuel emissions that drive climate change. The regulator's decision to deny the power plant upgrades in Astoria, Queens, and Newburgh, north of New York City, suggested confidence that the state will be able to build new renewable energy like wind and solar that comes from sources that are naturally replenishing quickly enough and at a sufficient scale to reliably supply power needs while meeting climate goals adopted by law in 2019. NRG Energy owns the plant in Astoria and wanted to upgrade, while Danskamar LLC sought to expand its generating capacity at the facility in Newburgh in Orange County, about 75 miles north of New York City, with a new gas fired plant. At the time, the promise of a new upgraded plant with smaller carbon footprint seemed like an unrivaled good. Over the past decade, NRG Energy suggested the plant could run even cleaner, promising it might one day be converted to run off green hydrogen, a new technology that has become a buzzword in climate circles, but is not yet commercially available. Current analysis from independent nonprofits that ensures Current analysis from the independent nonprofit that ensures a reliable energy supply, the New York Independent Systems Operator, shows that the supply would be expected to remain stable, even with the planned closing of the Astoria plant. A gay music teacher got married. The Brooklyn diocese fired him. After Mr. LaBanca married his boyfriend in August, he learned that a group of church leaders were debating his future and were pondering whether he also has another job within the Catholic Church, that that of minister. Though he has no formal religious training and his jobs do not involve religious education or preaching. On October 13th, the Diocese of Brooklyn, which encompasses the boroughs of Brooklyn and Queens, fired Mr. LaBanca because the church does not condone same sex marriage. In a statement concerning the decision, the diocese referred to Mr. LaBanca as a music teacher and minister and explicitly said he was fired because his marriage violates the requirement that ministers comply with church teachings. There are many people whose lives don't conform to church teachings, he said. Mr. LaBanca said the church's description of his role was extremely subjective and not minister with capital M, and that he signed no such contract for his job at the parish. Mr. LaBanca said he did not keep his sexual orientation a secret at work, although he didn't make a big deal of my wedding at all because he was aware of church teachings on homosexuality. Trooper charged with murder in death of girl 11 in high-speed chase. Not long before midnight on December 22nd, a New York State trooper stopped a car for speeding near Kingston, but about an hour and a half north of Manhattan. In the exchange that followed, Mr. Goods and the trooper, Christopher Baldner, began to argue, and Mr. Goods, his lawyer said, asked to speak to a supervisor. Trooper Baldner responded by shooting pepper spray into the car, officials said. Trooper Baldner, a 19-year veteran of the state police, turned himself in to the authorities early Wednesday. In yet another episode, which Governor Hochul cited when she named Miss James a special prosecutor in the case last week, Trooper Baldner struck a car in the same area in January 2017. Thomas H. Mungier, the president of the union that represents New York troopers, said in a statement that we look forward to a review and public release of the facts, including the motorist reckless acts that started the chain of events. Reached by phone on Wednesday, Mr. Goods declined to comment on the charges against Trooper Baldner and referred questions to his lawyer, Joseph O'Connor. Letitia James is preparing an announcement to run for governor. Letitia James, New York Attorney General, is preparing to announce as soon as Thursday that she will run for governor, according to 6 Democratic leaders briefed on her plans. Attorney General Letitia James has made a decision regarding the governor's race. The advisor, Kimberly Peeler Allen, said in a statement, Ms. James, 63, would enter the primary as the most formidable challenger to Ms. Hochul, New York's first female governor, who has taken an early lead in sparse public polling. A former New York City Council member from Brooklyn, Ms. James has won citywide and statewide office and would offer voters the chance at another historic first. If elected, Ms. James could be the first Black woman ever elected governor in the United States. One Democrat familiar with the Attorney General's thinking and deliberations said that Ms. James, who has considered the decision exhaustively, could still reverse the course and either announce an exploratory committee for governor or that she will seek another term as attorney general rather than pursuing the top post. Miss James would be giving up a powerful and secure position to run in a race she is not guaranteed to win, and some Democrats prefer her to stay in place as Attorney General to see through existing cases, including one involving Mr. Trump and his business. On migration, will the Americas succeed where Europe could not? As the arrival of thousands of Haitians in Del Rio, Texas last month showed, the United States may well start seeing many more migrants from countries outside the Northern Triangle nations of Central America. Almost 5 million Venezuelans have moved elsewhere in the Americas since 2015 as their country's economy imploded and political conflict intensified. There are now more than 1.7 million in Colombia, a million in Peru, and almost a half million in Ecuador and Chile each. The United States must enlist other countries in the hemisphere to become partners in measures to prevent recurrent political and humanitarian crises that force people to flee their homelands. In his opening remarks, Secretary Blinken acknowledged that the migration challenges we're facing in our hemisphere is not one country's problem. It's our shared problem, and it cannot be solved by any one country. The temptations will be to create a new regional arrangement to make borders harder to cross by increasing enforcement and deportation. Cooperation around deterrence is particularly hard to sustain among countries with varying capacity to welcome migrants and distinct concerns about migration. Such a program would also make it easier for U.S. government to negotiate the return of Haitian migrants who reach the border to these countries, where many have lived for years, instead of to Haiti. Cat dad versus the vegan. Real drama came in the Democratic primary as the winner, Adams, now enjoys a certain advantage that comes with being standard bearer for a party with 3.7 million voters, compared with Republicans' 566,000. The poor voters are supposed to go through a whole pile and pick a favorite, a runner-up, and a third section selection. As the votes are counted, the biggest losers are tossed off, and the people who picked them get their next choice put in the mix. Seven say they're Democratic farmer labor, which is going to give the voters quite a bit to scramble through when they aren't being distracted by the difference between the Independence Alliance and For the People parties. Another candidate calls himself Bob Again Carney. That's a great reminder of how many times you've gone to vote, looked at the ballot and moaned, not again. So, bottom line, big elections doing big election doings coming on Tuesday. Well, you can understand why the voters might be a tad depressed, given that a third of the city council has been arrested on charges like bribery and extortion. See, stuff like this is a summarized article. I'm not really sure what the original article is about, though, but we're going to dig into that one. Some of these, when I go back, I'm going to review. I'm doing by the end of this week, I'll have done 2 weeks worth of news. We'll go back and we'll pull out the narratives, but we'll pull out the details too. Well, we're going to dig into that one. Your county is getting a bad deal. Can you do better? Like a hostage with Stockholm Syndrome, many remain faithful to coal. Mr. Manchin has raked in money from the coal industry, both from political donations and from his stocks in a coal brokerage firm he founded and his son now controls. Growing up in West Virginia at the halftime of football games, there was a regular feature. I looked up Manchin and I realized he wasn't the son of elite. He was a grandson of immigrants. What was it? They owned a grocery store. His dad seemed, yeah, he was an immigrant success story, but now we realize he's the beginning of a dynasty, and his son he founded a brokerage firm specializing in stock, which his son now manages while he legislates um, coal. I'm sorry, getting a little tired from all the reading. He founded a firm specializing in coal while his son manages it while he legislates the coal industry. That's an obvious conflict of interest. We have to fix some of these things that are just blatant. Growing up in West Virginia at halftime of football games, there was a regular feature, a choir singing Coal is West Virginia. Mr. O'Leary told me the prevailing belief is that jobs and economic development have to be around coal. Appalachia, once a Democratic stronghold, voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump after he promised to bring back coal. Mr. O'Leary has been sharing the success story of Centralia, a coal town in Washington state, where a coal mine closed and the town's coal fired plant is in the process of being retired. Mr. O'Leary told me that officials in Appalachia are receptive as long as he doesn't get into politics or come across as a mortal enemy of coal. Pain and abuse by police, lawmakers must do what the Supreme Court will not. Last week, in two unsigned opinions, the Supreme Court showed its disdain for police reform. Even before last week, clearly established was a high bar for victims to overcome because it required that there be a prior case, either from the Supreme Court or the appellate court in the same jurisdiction, involving an almost identical set of facts. To drive their position home, the justices concluded neither Cortes Luna nor the Court of Appeals identified any Supreme Court case that addresses facts like the ones at issue here. There is a sharp departure from This is a sharp departure from the widely held assumption and practice that an analogous lower court case would be sufficient to alert officers that they were acting unlawfully. It's crazier still to think that the entire domain of unconstitutional policing can be defined by the tiny number of cases that the Supreme Court decides each year, especially if, as the court keeps insisting, victims must point to a nearly identical case before the police can be held to account. The obvious conclusion is that, for the most part, police conduct simply will go unregulated by the courts. For far too long, society has tried to regulate and fix policing by asking the courts to apply vague standards after the fact. Making cuts to pass Biden's agenda. In the movie Now Voyager, Betty Davis cautions her lover in a poignant scene, "Oh, Jerry, don't let's ask for the moon. We have the stars." I never anticipated a monumental social agenda in casting my ballot for President Biden. Of course, the president's opening gambit left room for negotiations and compromise. Who better to prevail over the opposition than a man fully rooted in decades of congressional deal making? The president has shown alarming vulnerabilities. There's nothing moderate about various spending programs the president is pushing. As an enthusiastic voter for Joe Biden, I am much relieved that our country now has a reasonable chance to build a respected standing in the world after Donald Trump's destructive trajectory. How then can it be that Mr. Biden's ratings are mediocre? Non-Trumpists should be rejoicing just in the fact that Mr. Trump is not president. I'm not a pilot, but I just flew a helicopter over California. Southern California startup that designed Flight OS, Skyrise, said it was working with major aircraft manufacturers to deploy the technology on everything from helicopters to small jets. Skyrise, a 50-person startup backed by $250 million in funding, spent years developing and testing a system that could fly on its own, using cameras, radar, and other sensors to track and respond to an aircraft's surroundings in flight. "We can build an autonomous aircraft and fly it," said Mark Groden, chief executive of Skyrise. Though some flying car makers say their aircraft will fly without pilots, most experts believe regulators are unlikely to approve autonomous flight until the end of the decade at the earliest. "We have a lot of the building blocks needed to automate flight," said Ian Villa, chief product officer of the electric aircraft company Whisper Aero and former head of strategy for Uber's electric aircraft project. "The real question is whether you can actually go to market." Mr. Groden hopes to fill the gap with Flight OS, a system designed for a wide variety of aircraft, including helicopters, jets, and flying cars. Pastry and persuasion: how a global tax deal got done. Checking the text messages real quick. Might have to. Again, I'm in a shared workspace until I can afford my own. In the end, the United States had to convince Ireland that its economy would be better off raising its cherished 12.5% corporate tax rate and joining rather than remaining a tax haven. And leaving the global tax systems under a cloud of uncertainty. Nearly 140 countries agreed to adopt a global minimum tax rate of 15% and settled on terms to tax large, profitable multinational corporations based on where their goods and services are sold rather than where they operate. The administration viewed persuading the rest of the world to set a global minimum tax as crucial to its own plan to raise the corporate tax rate to 28%, since that would minimize any competitive advantage. The United States wanted a minimum of tax of 21%, very likely a non starter for countries such as Ireland, which has relied on its 12.5% tax rate to attract international investment. Mr. Grinberg, a tax law professor at Georgetown University, who worked in the Treasury Department during the Bush and Obama administrations, was initially viewed as with skepticism by some progressives who noted that in 2016 and 17, he lamented America's singularly high corporate tax rate during congressional hearings and called for the rate to be slashed in favor of consumption tax. A deal among countries does not mean there is an agreement within those nations, including the United States, which will need to change America's tax code and potentially rewrite tax treaties to comply with the agreement. Higher food prices hit the poor and those who help them. Before, you didn't have to do that. You could just go in and buy a week or two's worth of food. Now you could barely buy a week's worth. She has turned to food banks in Indianapolis for help, but they too are feeling the pinch. A case of peanut butter that was $13 to $14 before the pandemic now costs 16 to 19, according to Alexandra McMahon, director of food strategy for the Gleaner Food Bank of Indianapolis. The scary thing is that food companies haven't passed along all of their costs yet. Higher transportation and warehousing expenses lead the list of causes, along with rising labor costs at meat processing centers and other nodes in this food supply chain. At the Oregon Food Bank, which distributes food to partners across Oregon and Southwest Washington, 1.7 million people sought assistance in 2020, compared with 860,000 in 2019, said Susanna Morgan, the group's chief executive. We already have the highest food prices in the country, said Richard Yust, executive director at the Maui Food Bank. To have food prices continue to escalate creates a great deal of pressure for families who have to feed their kids. Like Miss Mueller in Indianapolis, the Oregon Food Bank has stopped buying ground beef. Dreamliner delays drag down Boeing's quarterly earnings. Boeing said Wednesday that delays in making and delivering its troubled 787 Dreamliner jet will cost the company about $1 billion, weighing the company down from a broad travel, even as it benefits from a broad travel resurgence. The company provided estimates as part of its third quarter earnings report, which showed that Boeing lost $132 million in the 3 months ending in September, a loss of 19 cents per share. Boeing earned 15.3 billion in revenue in the quarter, up about 8% from the same period last year, and just below analysts' expectations. Boeing had paused deliveries of the plane briefly last year and again in May. In July, it said that it was slowing production of the plane, and this month, Boeing suffered another setback when a supplier told the company that certain parts it provided were made with the wrong titanium alloy. After deliveries start up again, Boeing expects to increase production to 5 per month. Boeing's airplane business brought in about 4.5 billion in revenue, with its defense, space, and security business bringing in 6.6 billion, and its services business bringing in 4.2 billion. Despite higher prices, McDonald's, Kraft, Heinz, and Coca-Cola post solid earnings. In April, the chairman and chief executive, James Quincy, announced that the beverage maker would raise prices to cope with rising commodity costs, though the company has not yet disclosed specific details. McDonald's reported a sales increase of 12.7% compared with the same quarter last year, helped by larger customer orders and menu price increases in the United States, as well as fewer restaurant closings in Europe. Nearly 80% of the fast food chain's U.S. dining rooms have reopened, but reductions in operating hours and capacity continue to weigh on its business, the company said. In a sign of rising inflation, the company increased prices 1.5% in its global restaurant and retail sectors, Kraft Heinz expects to enter next year, having executed the pricing plan that protects our profitability for current levels of cost. Paula Basilio, the company's chief financial officer, said on a call with investors, the surge in prices has created pressure on policymakers at the White House and the Federal Reserve, who have said that rising prices are temporary quirks caused by imbalance in supply and demand as the economy reopens. Now, from what I read, rising prices are based off of the Fed printing money. It's not true. It's just temporary. We'll see. We'll see whose read of reality, reading of reality is true. Just got reminded that I need to turn in a library book. Key takeaways from week 9 of the Elizabeth Holmes trial. Lisa Peterson's an investment manager at RDV Corporation, an investment firm representing Michigan's wealthy DeVos family, explained how the group came to invest and eventually lose $100 million in Theranos. Miss Peterson, who was put in charge of researching and facilitating the investment, testified that Theranos had handpicked a few wealthy families to invest and that Miss Holmes made the firm feel lucky to be included. With Miss Peterson's testimony, prosecutors built on how Theranos had appeared to use fake endorsements from pharmaceutical companies to deceive his partners and investors. Miss Peterson said the firm relied on what Miss Holmes and other Theranos executives told them. Mr. Wade tried to diminish Miss Peterson's decision-making power within the firm by pointing out that she was not on RDV's investment committee and was not present for all meetings involving Theranos. At the meeting, Miss Holmes downplayed the revelations. Miss Peterson said, saying the journal's reporting was done by a very overzealous reporter who wanted to win a Pulitzer. Mr. Wade asked the court to strike the comment from the record. Rent the Runway, a second-hand fashion site, makes its trading debut. The listing represents a milestone for the buzzy venture capital-backed company, which was founded in 2009 by Jennifer Hyman and Jennifer Carter Fleiss, and arrives during a flurry of initial public offerings from other venture-backed retail companies, including Warby Parker and Allbirds. The company has since expanded beyond weekend dress rentals, aiming to offer women a closet in the cloud through subscriptions. We've gone from a single dress and a single situation to building a full closet in the cloud that women can access for every occasion. That's a nifty buzz term, closet in the cloud. In its anyways, in its IPO filing, Rent the Runway pointed to a confluence of factors for its continued growth, including a shift from ownership to access, as typified by the popularity of companies like Netflix and Airbnb, increased interest in sustainability, and more working women who tend to spend more on workwear than their male counterparts. The company also cited studies saying that 33% of women consider an outfit old after wearing it fewer than 3 times, and that 1 in 7 women consider it a fashion faux pas to be photographed in an outfit twice. Social media not only increases the pressure that women feel to have variety in their wardrobes, according to the filing, but also gives the consumer a higher awareness of aspirational brands outside their income level. The company price offering at 21 per share, the high end of the 18 to 21 range that the company had marketed. Rent the Runway said in its filing that it was in the early innings of growth, noting that less than 10% of the company's total revenue had been spent on marketing since its founding, and that it believed it could increase awareness of the brand. Simeon Siegel, a retail analyst at BMO Capital Markets, said that the rental clothing market, which had attracted public companies like Urban Outfitters in recent years, remained very nascent. People have bought clothing since time immemorial, and companies are now trying to train people to consume clothing in a different way, Mr. Siegel said. Those gifts you want for the holidays, don't wait too long. We own a lot of inventory, but it's just not where we can use it, said Catherine Gold, the president of Goldbug, a children's sock manufacturer based in Denver. It's sitting on a boat or sitting in a port. Beyond the immediate challenges, the upending of supply chain has exposed fault lines for manufacturers and retailers because the cost of shipping rate rests on volume rather than the value of goods. Those who manufacture or import lower priced items get hit harder than, say, Apple, which ships iPhones. According to Keith Kaufman, the president and chief operating officer of Avanti Linens, a privately held textile and accessory company in Moonachie, New Jersey, we can produce a wastebasket for $9, but the freight from China and India, where we manufacture, can now cost $8 per basket. Last year, it cost roughly $1 to ship. Compounding the problems are increases in rail and trucking charges in the United States. It costs significantly more to transport the goods to warehouses or distribution centers. Mama Faye Sek started an organic skincare line with manufacturing in Senegal, where she grew up. The pandemic made manufacturing abroad difficult. She has put her production on hiatus while she searches for a plant closer to her home. Oil executives face Congress on climate disinformation. Executives of some of the world's biggest oil and gas companies, ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, and Shell, are set to appear before a congressional committee Thursday to address accusations that the industry spent millions of dollars to wage a decades-long disinformation campaign to cast doubt on the science of climate change and to derail action to reduce emissions from burning fossil fuels. The hearings mark the first time oil executives will be pressed to answer questions under oath about whether their companies misled the public about the reality of climate change by obscuring the scientific consensus that the burning of fossil fuels is raising Earth's temperature and sea levels with devastating consequences worldwide, including intensifying storms, worsening drought, and deadlier wildfires. Casey Norton, a spokesman for ExxonMobil, said in a statement that the company has long acknowledged that climate change is real and poses serious risks. He said the company's statements about climate science have been truthful, fact-based, transparent, and consistent with the broader mainstream scientific community at the time, and evolved as the science did. President Biden is expected to arrive at the talks, having re-engaged the United States with the global climate negotiations, and also having moved to reinstate some of the climate regulations removed by the Trump administration. In one prominent example, Lee Raymond, Exxon's chief executive at the time, said in 1997 that currently the scientific evidence is inconclusive as to whether human activities are having a significant effect on global climate. Questions are also expected to focus on how companies worked with groups like the American Petroleum Institute and U.S. Chamber of Commerce to lobby the United States government against taking strong action on climate. The group captured on video an Exxon lobbyist who said the company had fought climate science through shadow groups and targeted influential senators in an effort to weaken President Biden's climate proposal. Facebook tells employees to preserve all communications for legal reasons. Facebook has told employees to preserve internal documents and communications since 2016 that pertain to its business because governments and legislative bodies have started inquiries into its operations, according to a company email sent on Tuesday night. Over time, Facebook's core features such as likes, shares, groups, recommendations were not only used to expand the company, but were manipulated by some to harm users, documents show. Many Facebook employees wrestled with how to rein in the fallout. According to the documents, the leak of internal documents by a former Facebook employee has provided an intimate look at the operations of the secretive social media company and renewed calls for better regulations of the company's wide reach into the lives of its users. During an interview with 60 Minutes that aired on October 3rd, Frances Haugen, a Facebook product manager who left the company in May, revealed she was responsible for the leak of those internal documents. Documents from the Facebook papers show the degree to which Facebook knew of extremist groups on its site trying to polarize American voters before the election. The New York Times has these sentences it includes in all articles on a topic in order to keep the narrative. That's one indication of a narrative, is that every time they mention Facebook in these articles, which are 2 to 3 a day now, it says they knew of extremists trying to polarize voters during the election. Chip shortage dents earnings at GM and Ford. Revenue fell about 5% from a year earlier to $35.7 billion, while General Motors revenue declined 25% to $26.8 billion. With chips scarce because of the pandemic-related manufacturing and transportation issues, GM halted a production temporarily in August and September at plants across North America, including several that make its highly profitable pickup trucks and large sports utility vehicles. while GM was hit harder by the chip shortage than Ford in the third quarter. Ford had greater struggles earlier in the year because one of its key chip suppliers was also slowed down by a fire at the factory in Japan. Ford forecasts further improvement in the fourth quarter, although the tight supply of chips is likely to dog the auto industry for some time. Jerome Powell, the Federal Reserve chair, said he expects supply chain problems to persist, likely well into next year. Ford reported $1.8 billion in net income for the 3 months that ended in September, compared with $2.4 billion a year earlier. In a conference call with reporters, Ms. Barra said she met with a number of semiconductor suppliers to improve GM's supply of computer chips. All right, and now we have a couple pandemic articles and we are done. Merck will share formula for its COVID pill with poor countries. Merck has granted a royalty-free license for its promising COVID-19 pill to United Nations-backed nonprofit in a deal that would allow the drug to be manufactured and sold cheaply in the poorest nations, where vaccines for the coronavirus are in devastatingly short supply. Generic drug makers in developing countries are expected to market the drug for as little as $20 per treatment, compared to the $712 per course that the U.S. government has agreed to pay for its initial purchase. The license isn't perfect, he added. They never are, but it's going to be very helpful if the drug works as well as the hype and are safe enough. If the drugs work as well as the hype and are safe enough, it will make a difference. Merck has already taken a step of licensing 8 large Indian drug makers to produce generic versions of molnupiravir, molnupiravir pending authorization. The company feared that production is in just one region would not be enough to ensure rapid access to the drug across the developing world, said Janelle Krishnamurthy, Merck's vice president for global policy. During a long fight, during a long fight for affordably priced drugs to treat HIV in the early 2000s, Merck was a frequent target of activist ire, and the legacy of the battle clearly informs the company's decision making about access today. We have lost so many lives in the blocking of licensing, said Sembongjile Shabalala, chairwoman of the Treatment Action Campaign, the South African organization that lobbied global drug companies for affordable HIV drugs and has been campaigning in recent months for COVID vaccine access. COVID updates. Mexico resists vaccinating children just by court order. In a 6-month investigation, the panel found that Mr. Bolsonaro and members of his administration determined to reach herd immunity, discouraged people from wearing masks, ignored offers of vaccines from Pfizer, and promoted unproven drugs that long after they were found to be ineffective. An evaluation of data released by regulators on Friday from a clinical trial showed that Pfizer's vaccine was very effective at preventing symptomatic COVID-19 in children in that age range, and that the vaccine's benefits outweighed the risks of rare side effects. State health departments generally followed the recommendations of the CDC. Federal officials said that if pediatric doses of the Pfizer BioNTech vaccine are authorized, 15 million doses of vaccines will be immediately shipped to the states for distribution. Facing pressure for keeping its COVID vaccine out of reach of poorer countries. I think I messed this one up too. A lot like the last article. It's okay. We're 90% good, Shaz. You do not go to market when you are perfect. You go to market with what you have and you iterate along the way. That is the manifesto of getting things done. So this isn't perfect, but we acknowledge the mistakes. And this is also why we do it. We're doing multiple days at a time so we can see what the process is and how we can improve it. But I'm one man with no resources. Let's see what happens when I get little resources. Another struggle for long COVID patients, disability benefits. In July, at a White House event celebrating the Americans with Disabilities Act, President Biden promised to make sure Americans with long COVID who have disability have access to the rights and resources that are due under the disability law. But with no widely agreed on method of diagnosing the ailment, those who believe they have long COVID are finding it difficult to qualify under a system that is unfamiliar and already tricky to navigate. The pandemic forced the Social Security Administration to largely shut down in person services, and some experts predict a flood of applications with long COVID in the coming years, adding to the strained agency's workload. Addressing this disability backlog is one of our top priorities, Ms. Tigman said via email, acknowledging that the pandemic has increased wait times. Some people with long COVID symptoms have had success even without a positive coronavirus test. They're able to demonstrate a substantial downturn in their health and ability to work. We're looking at doctors' tests, medical records, past treatment, and whether they have other conditions. Long COVID has proved similar to other diseases, and that can be difficult to diagnose, including myalgic encephal. I could do this. Myalgic encephalomyelitis, fibromyalgia, rheumatoid arthritis, and post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. Let's try that one again. Myalgic encephalomyelitis. Myalgic encephalomyelitis. Myalgic encephalomyelitis. Close enough. Conditions that can also cause fatigue, memory issues, and joint pain. Many medical schools do not offer enough training on these types of diseases, and research for them is underfunded, said Linda Tannenbaum, chief executive of the Open Medicine Foundation, a nonprofit that funds research into chronic complex diseases like fibromyalgia and long-term COVID. Perhaps she also studies myalgic encephalomyelitis. Got it. All right. Dr. Stephen Martin, a physician and professor at the University of Massachusetts Medical School, said the complex nature of diagnosing long COVID required the coordination of various specialists who have also specific knowledge in the condition. Yes, you'll want to vaccinate your kids against COVID. An expert explains why. Vaccines to protect young children from COVID 19 are likely soon on their way. Just because COVID 19 is sickening and killing fewer children than adults does not mean that children are or have been free from risk. Vaccinating my children was an easy choice, knowing that the risk of COVID 19 to children is far greater than the risk of the vaccines. While these continue to be important safety precautions to keep young children safe, vaccination is the most effective layer there is. And sooner it can be safely available to all children, the better. That's why the American Academy of Pediatrics and other children's groups recently declared a national state of emergency for children's mental health. Even though a COVID 19 vaccine is coming for young children, there's still work to be done. Britain prepares for a post pandemic economy and keeps spending. Inflation is predicted to climb above 4%, potentially peaking around 5%, while jumps in energy prices have hit household bills. Many of Mr. Sunak's biggest policy decisions were announced in the days before his presentation to Parliament, including tens of billions of pounds in spending on national health services and public transportation, and nearly 7% increase in the minimum wage to £9.50. £9.50. Among the announcement made on Wednesday were tax relief for research and developing spending, a 50% discount on business rates, which is a type of property tax for retail and hospital businesses, a revamped tax arrangement for alcohol drinks that will result in cheaper beer draft and sparkling wine, tax relief for museums and theaters, a £1.4 billion investment fund, and an improvement in the generosity of a welfare benefit called Universal Credit for People Who Work. Government departmental spending will increase nearly 4% a year by the end of 2024. A lot has changed since March, when the Office for Budget Responsibility predicted unemployment would rise to 6.5%. The economy would only grow by 4% this year, inflation would be 1.5%, and borrowing would be £234 billion in the fiscal year ending in March 2022. The Office for Budget Responsibility now predicts its economy will rise 6.5% this year. Unemployment will peak at 5.2%, and borrowing will be £183 billion. I'm wondering what they predict inflation will be. They predicted last year inflation would be 1.5%. Let's just Google that real quick. That's probably in the original article that I cut out. Britain inflation prediction. You have to track what people say over time. That's why I've been researching this. When I said I wanted to get into politics, I was like, let me give it a year. Let me give it 2 years. It's been 4 years now. I didn't expect a pandemic. And then my personal life, I thought I was going to get married. We parted ways. I started a hostel in Puerto Rico. I've done a couple adventures over this. I'm not wealthy enough to merely think about politics and research. I've had to go back to work. Even though I let my real estate company go, I had to start other companies, which the hostel was going good until the pandemic shut me down. Kind of funny. You know what the name of my hostel was? Corona Rubia. You know why I had to stop? The coronavirus. Interesting, right? I had big hopes for the hostel, but that's going to be in the book. First, we monetize this, telling the news, and then we sell my books on peace to keep us focused and meditative and calm. And then I tell my story, which is quite an interesting story over the last couple of years and my life, really, but the last couple of years specifically. I got this idea in 2010 before I joined Occupy Wall Street. I've been meditating on this for a minute, and I've given the world and other options time to speak their truth, speak their piece. And I think it's time for me to give my version of events as I see them. Since I was a teenager, in high school, I started an underground newspaper. It's on my 10 Bone Press Instagram. The link should be below. 10 Bone Press, at 10 Bone Press. You see my high school underground newspaper. So since 16, 17, I've been watching the world, asking questions. And back then we were protesting. 1999, we protested the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle. That was the beginning of pretty much global anti-corporatist movement, because it was the beginning of the consolidation of global corporatist power. So there has been an alternative narrative, and we're just not acknowledged. Then Bill Clinton, in the State of the Union the next year, acknowledged Columbine, which also happened then. But he did not acknowledge the anti-WTO protest. Instead, he claimed there was a consensus on global trade. And he called us anarchists, which I do respect the anarchist political tradition. If you watch their version of history, at least before it was co-opted by these new libertarians who just defend property rights, it was actually a criticism of state power and what was at the time the push of states to get us to kill each other for corporate profits, known as World War One. So all of these things, there's narratives that better explain the world, and they're out there. And all people like me offer is speak your truth. What is your truth? What is your explanation of the world? Put it up against my explanation, and then let the children, really, this is for the new generations, because I'm going to die. All of us, no one's going to live forever. Even if they cured death, you'll fall downstairs. Something will happen. We all die. We only delay it. So any knowledge, any wisdom, any work we do now is for future generations. That's what we started this podcast for. The moral imperative is to leave the world better than you found it, so that future generations can have the same resources you have. And everything I say, everything I speak, as a politician, I believe that we collect stories and we gather things into the narrative. We are the narrative architects in chief. So anything I say, I do originate some of my theories. And that's my contribution to the historical record, that when they look back and they see Shaz, they say, these are the original ideas. He contributed to our collective understanding of humanity and the world around us. But usually, even if it's my own ideas, it's based off the work of others. If I reinvented the wheel, I'd be reinventing the axial age and reinventing Buddhism, Christianity, Western civilization. Even before then, I'm going to reinvent cultural traditions that have gone back thousands of years, the Tao, the Upanishads, or whatever, the Indian sacred texts. No, so I read and I gather. I add my little bit, but my little bit is like drops of water in the ocean. So most of what I say, I can find you a book that says it better than what I can say it. I'm just adding a little bit of Shaz twist. So yeah, there's a really nice philosophy book I picked up, which makes that argument that the moral imperative, the responsibility of the current age is to be a steward for the environment. And all I add to that is the criticism of war and empire, because we're not allowed to do that for some reason. It's because they try to kill you, right? America, what do you do, America, to people who try to reform you? You kill them, right? That's what we've done. Was it my parents, when you talk to them about reform, what is the biggest event of the previous generation's lives? The assassinations, MLK, JFK, Malcolm, Lumumba, around the world. Was it Allende in Chile? Who did they assassinate? Pinochet came after Allende, right? We just found out recently they assassinated. I mean, it's not even political leaders. My favorite poet. Uh, I'm blanking on him. 20 Poems of Love. See, you put me on the spot. I rewrote his poems. Chilean poet. Pablo Neruda. Also, he's a great model for life because he's an artist, like I consider myself. I write all my life just as an expression and outlet, how I earn love, how I earn esteem, how I just express myself in the world around me. Shaz is in his best headspace when he's writing. So I look at these artists who also enter the political realm, and that's amazing to have that other skill and to have that other ability to take on that burden, because being an artist is hard enough. And they find out recently that he was probably assassinated by his government with the help of the United States. How many other cultural leaders have been assassinated as well as political leaders? That is what our supposed civilization does to reformers when it doesn't like the conversations that they bring up. So that is a game we are playing of life and death. And who's going to get who first, right? But do I believe in assassination? No, I believe in conversation. Let the better ideas win. But it's better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in war. And if you don't believe we're in a war, you're not paying attention. So I am trying to bring you back up to speed to the situation in which we find ourselves by auditing first the news and then our power systems and then offering alternatives. I'm not going to make it to another day. I have to get out of here. I've been texted that I'm about to be turned into a pumpkin. So I got to go. And all this is going to change into something else, which it is during the day. Thank you for the couple hours of time. This is Shaz Barbaric. Years for the Revolution. Signing off.